Of all the Christian philosophers that I have spoken to, all but one, to my recollection, would vehemently fight with me when I would say, is God all-powerful? Is God all-knowledgeable? Is there evil in the world? Yes, 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 you believe in God. Then God created evil. I mean, I'm trying to be a very simple approach to it. And I'd get fights back and never make any progress. There was one who was different from that, who said that there's no way to get out of that God created evil, and went through the process. Right. I really don't know the Islamic view of whether God created evil.
Bismillah. So Muslims believe that there's something called the qadar, which is traditionally translated as fate, destiny, but the root meaning of it is the idea of measuring something out. So there's an idea that God has measured everything out. He's given us enough rope to save us or hang us. And so moral evil is a result of the sinfulness of human beings. So what comes from that? And there's also an understanding that a lot of natural evils are either one of two things, that God is, there's a punishment that could be involved. It's not for us to decide, but it could be a punishment, or it could be an elevation in rank, and to take martyrs amongst them. For instance, our Prophet said that anybody that dies from a house collapsing on him is a martyr. It's a martyr's death, so they go straight to heaven. So all the people that died in the earthquake by their houses collapsing on them, they're considered martyrs. And also dying of sudden death is a martyr's death, like in a car accident, falling from your animal. Dying from like a stomach cancer or something like that is a martyr's death. So there are many deaths, the Prophet said, that are martyr's deaths because of the intensity of the death, and also the lack of time that sometimes that people have to make amends and do these things. So I think we believe that God created everything, but we don't attribute evil to God as a kind of just appropriateness. So we have a formula that the Prophet gave us that said, all of good is in your presence and evil is not attributed to you. But we believe that evil is part of God's creation. God obviously created the evil in the world by allowing it to happen if it's moral evil, and then by the events of natural evil that are clearly created by God.
Yeah, so on the moral evil, God certainly allows it, because if you believe in God and it's happening, then it's obvious that God allows it if you still want to believe in God. But you roll it back to say, when God created the universe, did God know that evil would occur?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
I mean, so-called open theology in the Christian tradition, modern today, not mainstream, but not insignificant, would say that the future is open, and God is omniscient that God knows everything that can be known,
right.
But the future cannot be known because it hasn't occurred yet.
Right.
So we're not undercutting God's omniscience, because we're saying that, like, can God lift a rock that's too heavy to
logical inconsistency.
Yeah, logical inconsistency. So there's no undermining of God with a logical inconsistency. So they say the future is a logical inconsistency to know. So that's a coherent explanation.
Right.
It may not be satisfying to you, but it's a lot, or to anyone. But it's a logical consideration.
Well, there's a famous saint in Turkey who had his students, and he wanted to appoint somebody to follow him. So he asked all his students to reflect that night on what they would remove from the world if they could. And so the next day he comes, and the first one says, "I'd get rid of murder because it's the worst thing," and the next one says, "I'd get rid of alcohol because it's the source of so much evil. I'd get rid of adultery. I'd get rid of..." They all giving their things they'd take out of the world. And it got to the Saint Marquez Effendi, and he said, "I would not take anything out of a world that God created for its purposes." And so that's just, I think, a very Muslim view of things, that there are wisdoms, and God knows why And there's a theodicy of the grand scheme of things, right? That we just don't know. But God does bring good out of evil, and then evil serves its purposes in that people rise up and oppose it, that people bear the burdens of oppression, and still maintain faith in God. There's a wonderful, it's not a true hadith, but I like it anyway, that says anybody who reaches 80 years of age still believing in God is forgiven.
Well, I got a couple to go, so I'm almost there.
Yeah. But I think the idea, if you live long enough, you're going to see a lot of very troubling things.
That's a great one. I like that.
Yeah.
Even if it's not true, if it's not a real one, but I'll quote you. Yeah, no, that's very good. But the overarching point, though, is that either God knew or didn't know the amount of evil in the world when God created the universe. I mean, and once you reach that nodal point, you have to make a choice.
Yeah, and one of the things that I find really interesting, like I've been in a lot of places in the world, and the people I've seen that suffer the most often have the most profound belief in God. And the people that sit around with their kind of wine, cheese, and crackers discussing evil, and why I don't believe in God, they actually very often have wonderful lives. And so there's kind of an irony in that.
Yeah, that is true. That is true. I'm not sure that gives an answer to the question.
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of a sociological
observation.
Yeah, and it's fair. It's a fair one. I just think that there needs to be a coherent approach to God. I mean, if I'm going to believe in God, then we need to have a coherent approach, and to shirk from the idea that God is omnipotent and omniscient, and yet distinguish, and yet the evil is something that God has allowed in order for us to have free will, with the free will defense, the Theodicy of free will.
That's
a classic defense in terms of we needed that.
And that only deals with moral evil. It doesn't deal with natural
evil. Exactly. And it doesn't deal that effectively with moral evil.
Because now we have sociologists. I mean, that's one of the things Dostoevsky points out, is that the time is coming when they'll tell us there is no crime, because the sociologists are going to say, well, the reason they did this is, so there's kind of a hard determinism that says, oh, that criminal couldn't have done anything else given the life that he was given. So there are those arguments. And again, I personally believe there's compelling arguments on both sides, and you have to make your choice. I've chosen the side of God, and other people chose the side of either nothingness, randomness, or the side of the devil.
Well, I hope I'm not in the latter category.
It doesn't seem like that, but yeah, it seemed like a mensch.
The classic Abrahamic religions, all of them certainly believe that God intervenes in human affairs, both in our personal lives and in the flow of history and nations in one form or another. The question I always have is how does God do that? And there are radically different ways that sophisticated philosophers in the traditions who are believers explain that. What is the mechanism by which God has done that? What is the Islamic view?
Well, the Islamic view, Bismillah, the Islamic view is that God is actively engaged in every instant with creation, sustaining it. And without that active engagement, that their existence would not be here. The other thing is the providential care, the protection. I mean, one of the things that we see in the world is that generally things are peaceful, and in the vast majority of places, people feel a kind of security in their person and property. Those are great blessings. They can be disrupted, but that in some ways is a proof of our natural inclination to kind of experiencing order. And one of the ideas about any gross disruptions that happen to human beings, the idea like of an earthquake, is there's all this order, and then suddenly all this chaos comes in, but then there's a restoration of order. And that's to remind us that order is the norm. that experiencing order is, and that's one of the great blessings from God. So God, in essence, throws these wrenches in our works in order for us to grow. And always, I've met several people who've been in prison unjustly. I have a friend, Tobias Tubbs, who spent 28 years in prison, African-American, beautiful man. And he spent his time, he said, okay, is this what God wants from me? And he spent his time helping other people in prison. He's helped thousands of inmates who were there for crimes. So a man who was there without crime could help all these people. He chose to do that. That was a choice. And I almost every person I've ever met who's been in prison, and I spent time unjustly when I was in West Africa in jail. That was a horrible experience. But when I saw the notes, I was only 19 years old, but when I saw the notes that my friend who was with me had written, he sent them to me a couple years ago, and I was telling him, oh, this is a great blessing. This only happens to people close to God, like prophets and things like Joseph. He was in prison. Like that's how I was. And I was happy that at 19 I had that vision of the tribulation was actually from God. One of our great mystics, Ibn Atta'illah, said that one of the things that will mitigate the pain of his tribulation is to know that God is the one trying you. And so these are things that we grow from. Like I said, I've met several people who've been in prison, and they've all said to me the same thing: it was the best thing that ever happened to me. And I wouldn't want to go to prison. I hope it doesn't happen to you or anybody I know. But there are people that do get great benefit from actually being forced to confront themselves in a way that they'd never had before. And I think tribulation does that for people.
So when God intervenes in the world, I mean, there are several different mechanisms by which God can do that. God is sustaining the world, so at any given nexus, God could change things, can fiddle with the dials at any point in the world if God's sustaining. That's one way. It's sort of an active, proactive, in time kind of reaction to move things. The other way, it says that somehow from all creation, God sort of knew what things were happening so that God could create a world in which he did not have to intervene, but all of the activities that would have occurred, God knew beforehand. There's something
like a deistic type.
Deistic, but it's a philosophy called middle knowledge, where God had an infinite number of choices of worlds that you could have. And part of this is to harmonize human freedom, because if God is continually manipulating things, maybe we don't have as much freedom, and to be sure that God's providence is secured so that the outcomes of various things are absolutely 100% known, which, human freedom and God's absolute providence seem like they're philosophically contradictory at first. And so how do you deal with that? Well, so do you privilege one over the other, human freedom versus God's providence?
I mean, there is a kind of soft determinism. There is an idea that things are fated and that we accept that, but at the same time we believe that we do have free will. So it's kind of holding those two in a kind of balance. And that's why whenever anything in the past has happened, we just say, mashallah, God has willed that. And that, according to the Quran, is to free your heart from the stress of, oh God, if I only if I only done that, if I'd only done that it eliminates that problem.
That's good.
Yeah,
that works. That's
it
nice.
works.
Yeah.
It does work.
Whether it's true or not, irrelevant, it works.
It works, and it's very effective. And that's why Muslims tend to be fatalists about the past, but they're not fatalists about the future. They believe that we have choices. And so, there's a trope that says, oh, Muslims are fatalists, but it's not actually true. We do believe that God has given us the ability to choose. And even if we have neuroscience that tells us, oh, before you make the choice, there's already things
there's a lot of problems
happening in your brain and things like that. But that would be God's foreknowledge preparing you for the choice that you are going to freely make. It doesn't, these things for believers, I mean, that's why, in essence, religion is kind of in the Popperian sense, it's non-falsifiable, because we really can come up with some kind of solution to the problem. And it drives people that are, not believers a little crazy. But I just feel again that we're going to search for the best answers, and maybe there's answers that we haven't found yet that we'll find. Maybe these great beasts of computers are going to end up telling us things that
I doubt that. But
yeah,
that's
I do
my
too.
That's my own personal
I do too,
bias.
but who knows? You know.
So I mean, look, we have free will, we have God's providence, and it seems to me that if I heard you right, that you have to be a little soft on both in order to harmonize them.
Right.
Because some people say that's not true. Say something you can keep them both hard and maintain some logical principle. But I don't see that. I like softening both of them,
right,
because then they work.
Yeah, I think we're in agreement on this. Imam Ali was once asked, "Do we have free will, or is there just choice?" And he said, "Lift your leg." Right leg, and he lifted his leg, and he said, "Now, without putting it down, lift the other one." He said, "I can't." He said, "It's between those two." So, I mean, we didn't choose our parents, despite what New Age people say. We didn't choose, the type of health we would have. There is some level of choice in health, but generally, if you had bad genes, you didn't choose that. Yeah.
Hamza, all of the Abrahamic religions, in their essence, believe in divine providence. But there's a distinction between what it means, as I've discerned it, between those who believe that providence means that God will know the total outcome of the world, maybe individual nations, and that the end result is certain and that things will be positive, the devil will be put in prison or whatever it is. And others who believe that not only that, but God knows every single event, every single movement of every single molecule and every single part of the universe, and that's what providence means. In the Islamic tradition, which are the two, something in between, how do you deal with divine providence?
They're both, from a Muslim perspective, they're both absolutely true. So on the one hand, the creation is moving towards a destiny, and that destiny will be fulfilled in another world. And there's a providential care in assuring that happens. And then on the other hand, we believe that God is directly engaged in every instant with the creation, sustaining it, and according to the dominant understanding, actually recreating it in every instant. So there's a kind of occasionalist belief that many Muslims hold. So that means that God is providentially taking care. For instance, we actually believe if we took your temperature or my temperature right now, it'd probably be around 98.6 in our measurement with Fahrenheit. That's God that's doing that. And if it goes up, that's God. If it goes down, that's God. If your blood sugar, you take sugar and the insulin's released, that's God. So that's providence for us. God is in every instant taking care of us. And then when it goes wrong, it's also God. That is...
Does that lead to a fatalism or on one hand, or a diminishment of free will on the other?
Well, that's a good question. I think there's on the one hand, it does give us a kind of acceptance of things, but on the other hand, we do believe that we do have free will in that limited area of our agency, that God has given us will, that volition, that we are volitional creatures and we have moral agency. So, and in fact, like Kierkegaard, we believe that every instant, in essence, is it's an ethical choice that's being made.
Even stronger position than God knowing everything is, in essence, God causing everything, and the occasionalistic view, which comes out, I think, of the Islamic tradition. Right. Not all Muslims believe that, of course,
sure.
But it is a way to intensify strongly God's involvement in the world, and basically that says that in the causal process of anything going on, that God has an active role as opposed to just setting the stage and the actors, meaning the molecules, doing their thing.
Right.
That at every stage God is is in those in the causal chain.
Which is why the mystic who experiences God directly sees that reality. There's a great Egyptian scholar and mystic, Ibn Ata'illah, who said, when was God absent that God needed to be proved to exist? That for the mystic, God is never absent. And there's a tradition where the Prophet Muhammad said, as people draw closer to God, God becomes the eye with which he sees, the ear with which he hears, the tongue with which he speaks, the hand with which he grasps, the leg with which he walks. So in other words, there's an experience of that divine reality.
What's the extent of the belief in occasionalism where God is involved in the causal chain of everything that happens? Is that mainstream or not?
It's mainstream. I think that would be the dominant belief. There are people that believe in secondary causation, but the vast majority of Muslims would hold, at least the scholars. I mean, a lot of common Muslims might not know, but that is the view of Imam al-Ghazali, of many of the great scholastics of Islam, and it became the dominant creed. The way I put it is there's the quantum and the Newtonian. So at the Newtonian, we believe in secondary causation. That if I harm somebody, I'm responsible for the harm. God didn't cause it. I caused it. But at that quantum level, we would say that everything is created by God.
It sounds like a contradiction, though, because the quantum level sits below the Newtonian in a sense, and that's the real stuff that's going on.
Well, I mean, I think they're both real. We're living. I'm not going to walk through the wall. I'm not going to jump off this building. I mean, we're living in a Newtonian world of Newtonian physics, of cause and effect. But there is a world underneath it that, I mean, they're challenging even the whole concept of cause and effect now at places like CERN. That is there really cause and effect?
It's a longer conversation, but the concept of occasionalism, though, some have said had undermined the process of science, because if God's involved in all the causation, then science takes a lower position in the that argument does not convince me at all, because first of all, the Muslims, when they were at the height of their certainly their prowess civilizationally, they were at the forefront of sciences, and many of them were actually occasionalists. So it didn't stop them from working with the world that God has given them. I mean, the foundational text that we believe by Imam Nasafi says that the reality of things is fixed. It's, حقائق الأشياء ثابتة, it's fixed, and the knowledge of those things is realized. So and then it talks about the way that we know those is through facts and through the five senses. So empiricism is real for the Muslims. I mean, we believe in empirical science. At the same time, you believe in occasionalism.
Yeah, and I think there's a type of challenge for people to hold contradictory thoughts in their mind. Einstein, I think, said it was a sign of genius. So I think the Muslims maybe had a type of genius that people haven't really appreciated.
So each of the Abrahamic religions believes in an end time, in the sense that there will be a closing of the age of human activity as we have known it for at least in written history, 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 years. And that there will be that God will have some kind of intervention. In Judaism, they're looking for the Messiah. In Christianity, it'll be the return of the Messiah. And Islam, there's a kind of a prophet who will come. I'd like to understand from the Islamic point of view what the end time means. What are the signs that you would look for, and then maybe how it articulates with the Jewish and the Christian view?
Sure. Bismillah. So the end times is, first of all, very much part of Islam. In one of the most famous traditions of the Prophet, peace be upon him, he talked about, he was asked by Gabriel, what is Islam? And he gave him the 5 pillars, and he asked him, what is Iman, faith, and he gave him the 6 articles of faith. Belief in God, belief in the angels, belief in the messengers, belief in the books, belief in the last day, and belief in the idea of the qadr, this kind of fate or the measuring out. And then he asked him about the signs of the end of time.
Yeah.
And he said, the one asking does not know more than the one being asked does not know more than the one asking. And so then he said, then tell me its signs. So he gave the signs, and in our tradition there's the lesser signs and then there's the greater signs. So the lesser signs are many in our tradition. I mean, there's really a lot of very specific signs of the latter days, where the Prophet ﷺ said that there would be widespread knowledge. He said inanimate things would talk. He said that you would find men being satisfied with men and women being satisfied with women would be much, very widespread. He said that people would spend their time with musical instruments on their heads, which nobody understood at the time. He said that people would have on their sides, they would have things that would tell them what their family was doing at home. He said that people would travel between the cloud and back to the earth. Many, many signs. He said that metal would speak. Nataq al-hadid. I mean, it's very interesting signs. He said that the skyscrapers would, that there would appear buildings that would reach the mountain tops. He said that the destitute Arabs would compete in vying to build bigger and bigger buildings. He literally said destitute goat herders amongst the Arabs would compete to building higher buildings. He also said that that there would be wars like the Christian tradition, wars and rumors of wars. He said that people would speak and their lie would reach the horizon instantaneously. So many, many signs that he told us about. But then there's these great signs.
Certainly all the smaller ones, one could say, as you've described them,
they're already here
today.
Yeah, they're already here. And I think many Muslims have felt that a lot of Muslims I've heard, they ask me, are these the latter days? You know, they kind of feel that.
They think you know.
They think I know. I don't know, but they do feel like are these the latter days?
And it's a legitimate question to ask.
Seems like it is a legitimate question. In the end, the Muslims believe so. These major signs, we believe in this antichristic world leader that comes called the Masih ad-Dajjal. We also believe in the second coming of Jesus, who is we believe is the Messiah that the Jewish community missed, and that he will come at the end of time.
So you believe that Jesus' return as the Messiah is a sign of the end times, or that is the end?
That's we're almost at the very end. Yeah, when once Jesus returns, but there will be a period.
So how does that differentiate from the Christian view?
Well, the Christians see Jesus as part of the Godhead.
Right. Sure.
So, there is a sophisticated Catholic and Orthodox tradition of the dual nature. There are some Christians that believe in the monophysite nature. I think a lot of evangelicals seem to believe that Jesus is God. So they believe that he's coming back as God,
Okay. But in the Muslim tradition, but Jesus is coming back.
He's a prophet.
As part of this process. Any other prophets coming back?
No, but some say that Elijah is. There is a belief in Elijah as an immortal.
There's actually another Jewish guy in there.
Elijah is very interesting. Yeah.
How about what I read about I forgot the name, Mahdi?
The Mahdi.
Mahdi.
So there is a belief in the Mahdi.
What is that?
That's a dominant belief. But there are scholars who believe that there's no Mahdi except for Jesus, that Jesus is the Mahdi. But the dominant belief is that there is a person who comes back and revives Islam and unites the Muslim community when the world's filled with a lot of injustice. And the Prophet ﷺ, he said that Islam would last 30 years as a political phenomenon. only 30 years. And when his grandson Hassan, that was literally at the 30-year point. And then he said it would become monarchies. And then he said the monarchies would be followed by tyrannies. And the monarchies would be followed by tyrannies, and they would be horrible. And then he said then it would go back to the prophetic model, which Muslims understood to be the Mahdi. It's very strong in the Shia tradition. I think some of the Shia saw Barack Hussein, Obama as kind of a sign of because Hussein is held very high in both Sunni and Muslim, Shia, but particularly in the Shia tradition. Yeah.
So he disappointed them in the end.
I think so.
So with the Mahdi comes back, unifies the Islam, is that a sign of the end, or is that the end itself?
And it's not the end. No. So the end, eventually, there's an understanding that it will go back to the loss of that prophetic tradition, and then there will be, a terrible war, that happens, a kind of Armageddon type scenario, and then basically the worst people will be left. And then the end comes.
And then what happens? How do we make it better? Does God intervene in some way, or
just the afterlife? There's a closing of the earth. Yeah. So the human species comes to an end.
It starts bad, gets worse, and then is destroyed.
Is destroyed.
So at the end is very different than the Christian and the Jewish tradition, which has God coming back. When Jesus comes back, then he takes over the earth and reforms the earth and makes peace to go out from Jerusalem.
Well, there is a period like that, but it's followed.
It's followed, because in the Christian tradition, that is the end, and therefore that's a new beginning, and that's the permanent, the new heaven and the new earth
here.
Yeah,
we don't believe that.
But you said that
no, we move to another dimension.
So you would have that as a kind of a false hope.
Yeah.
If that happens, so other people are thinking it's the ultimate, but you're thinking that.
Well, I think there's a lot of as there's a certain iteration of Christianity that is looking forward to the end times.
Oh, sure.
We're not.
Sure.
We're not. Like Muslims don't. Like in the Jewish tradition, you should avoid bringing near the end times.
Yeah.
The Muslims have the same idea. You don't want to be a sign of the end of time.
Right.
Yeah, you want to be a zaddik. We call it siddiq. Same word. Yeah. So that's our goal, is to forestall, because we want to keep the theater of enlightenment.
No, the Christians like to see the end
some
times.
Christians, I don't think all, but
sure.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of the fundamentalists would see the end time, because after that, then Jesus would come and the world would be peaceful forever after. But you're saying the end time is going to be totally removed, and we're going to move to another dimension, and that's
that's when the end comes. Okay. And there's a tradition. It's almost is similar to the rapture. The idea that that people are removed, the believers, and then there's only left the disbelievers, and then it's
all right. Well, I hope I'll go with you.
The end. Yeah. Well. It's very easy, La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah, and then I'll take your hand.
So what may seem like a very trivial and obvious question, why believe in God? I like to ask different people, because the general answer I know. I mean, I think everybody sort of knows why some people think we should believe in God. But I like to hear the nuances, the way people describe articulate it. So from an Islamic point of view, from your own personal view, I mean, what is the benefit for believing in God?
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah. It's a fair.
So what's the best answer you've ever heard for that? Have you thought about it?
Yeah, no, I'm not sure I can tell you that there's a best answer. The answer is generally operative in terms of the person. How it'll benefit you, and what's the benefit for you, and I guess what I'm looking for is answers that are not as obvious as that.
Sure. Well, for me, I don't feel like I have a choice. I don't really, I could give you a lot of whys, but for me, God is so self-evident that to not deny him would like denying my own existence, personally. I really feel that. Mm-hmm. I really feel it's impossible for me to not believe in God, because mm-hmm. everything to me confirms God, and I've seen that in my own life, and I feel, there's a wonderful poem by Robert Frost about looking at the ocean. You ever seen that poem? The people along the sand, they all look one way, they turn their backs on the land, they look at the sea all day. Well, and then he says, the land may vary more, but wherever the truth may be, the people turn their backs and look at the sea. And it strikes me as, why do people look at the ocean? Because the land does vary more. Mm-hmm. What is it? What's the fascination with looking at the ocean? And I feel like a believer is the ones he's looking at the ocean, and the disbeliever is looking at the land. Mm-hmm. And then when the believer sees the whale, look at this, turn around, look, did you see? And then it's gone. Mm-hmm. And I feel like when you accept God, God will continually show you reasons to continue to believe in God. And when you reject him, there's a verse in the Quran that says that we will remove our signs from people that show arrogance in the earth. And they can see every sign and they will not believe. And so the most important thing is the Catholics have this tradition of the skeptic's prayer, which I actually really like. This idea of just saying, God, I don't know if you're there, but if you're there, help me find you. And I think if somebody really genuinely prayed that prayer, I think God would show up. And so I just believe God is real, and I believe that God does present that reality to people that are willing to just humble themselves and say, I believe.
Yeah, I easily can see myself in that position because I really do want to. It's just that I worry about fooling myself. I'm not worried about others fooling me. I'm egotistical enough to know that no one can fool me. You can't fool me, but I can fool myself. So that's what scares me.
Well, the devil might be able to fool you too.
Well, I maybe I should worry about that.
They say his, Tilliard famously said his greatest trick was convincing people he didn't exist.
Right. Yeah, so, again, I think I'm very much in control of what I believe and how I believe and how I articulate to myself. But I really do feel fooling myself because I really do want to believe.
Yeah.
And it's very easy for hope to swamp reason. And yet I understand that reason in its rigorous sense may be an inhibition to see God, because many people have told me that. Many people criticize what we do, the part of Closer to Truth that deals with meaning and search for God, by saying it's all intellectual, and you can't intellectually know God, that you have to do it experientially. Yeah. And my comeback to that is not that they're wrong. Right. They may be right, but I cannot discern the difference between the wheat and the chaff, if there's any wheat at all. I can intellectually, but I cannot experientially, right? And does that put me in an impossible situation where I'm rejecting the only real evidence? Right.
Well, I think again another why is for me is that it seems to be the most obvious explanation for being here and being as coherent as we are. The fact that our minds are so beautifully correspondent with creation itself. I mean, how could we know something like the universal law of gravity? Like, how could our minds be so matched to the universe to know that? How could we work out things like fine-tuning and the anthropic principle? How could we determine Van Allen's belts and these things? I mean, it's quite stunning what the human mind has been capable of doing, and that mind is constantly generating thought. And where does that thought come from? Jalaluddin Rumi says, silence, ask God, and the answers will come.
So one of the the atheists' primary points in disproving God is the severe contradictions in religious teaching, certainly among the major religions of the world, that there are points of obvious contradiction. And so the fact that these contradictions are so obvious invalidates them all. And so we have a choice. We recognize the contradictions. Sure, there are some similarities. They all seem to believe in something beyond the physical. I mean, when you devolve down to the commonalities among the religions, which some have tried to do philosophically, John Hick famously looks to the real. But when you look at the lowest common denominator, you don't wind up with very much.
Right.
So how do you respond to that?
Well, I mean, I would say that one, I personally love religions. Like I've studied religions both academically and also just out of personal interest. So I do love religions. I think there is immense amount of truth in all the religions that I've studied, especially the world's great religions, the ones that have large numbers of people. Yeah. But they obviously, there's difference. There's a lot of dovetailing. I mean, there's a lot of things that we agree upon, but there are differences. So in the Islamic tradition, we're a supersessionist religion. So we do believe that Islam came and abrogates the previous dispensations, but it acknowledges the previous dispensations. If there's differences, it's because they've been changed or altered. That's how the Muslims view it.
But Christians as well. And
yeah.
they just had one less to
deal with. Right, exactly. But the Abrahamic tend to, the Jewish and the Jewish tradition believes in the Noahides, right?
Yes, right, sure.
But their mandate is to teach, the Noahides for the rest. So the 613 is for them, but the 7 is for everybody else. Right. It's a lot easier. But the Muslims actually believe that all peoples had prophets. All peoples. The Quran is very clear that there's been no people except they had messengers sent to them. So there are remnants and traces of prophetic tradition all over the world, which is why you have a lot of these themes and a lot of the morality. I mean, there's differences, but there's a lot of similarities. So we believe that we acknowledge the previous dispensations and also the Muslims have traditionally allowed them to coexist with them in Muslim states. So the Muslims always protected the Christians. I mean, there are periods, they're bad periods, but by law,
it's absolutely true.
Yeah, by law they had to. But I mean, there's bad rulers. Like we had a ruler in the 11th century in Jerusalem that burnt down the Church of the Sepulchre, but the ruler right after him rebuilt it. Because it was just an act of madness. So, and the Christians historically have lived with the Muslims. There's 12 million Christians in at least 8, I think, but closer to 12 in Egypt. The Coptic Christian Church was protected, even though they were persecuted by the Byzantines. So the Muslims have recognized that. The Jewish community, Bernard Lewis wrote a book about how much better Jews fared in Muslim lands than they did in Europe.
Yes, for sure.
It wasn't perfect.
That was a low hurdle.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, and it certainly wasn't perfect, but there are periods of great collaboration between the scholastics amongst the Jewish and Muslims. And then also in India, there's some bad periods, but there's also periods where people like Darushakhu, the great Mughal prince of Shah Jahan, who built the Taj Mahal, he actually translated the Upanishads into Persian. And the Upanishads are really consistent with Islamic teaching. Any Muslim that read the Upanishads would feel like they were reading Muslim commentary. And he actually felt the Upanishads were mentioned in the Quran, Darushakhu. So the first translation of the Upanishads into European language in English was done from Persian, from a Muslim translation of a Hindu text. So I think Muslims have been taught to respect religions, but we do believe that Islam superseded the previous dispensation.
So let's follow that. The dispensation we were talking about was obviously the Hebrew Bible and then then the Christian dispensation, which changed that in their perspective, and then the Islamic tradition did that. But how then did the Islamic tradition deal with other non-Abrahamic religions?
Right.
Because there was nothing to supersede, in a sense, if you're dealing with Hinduism or Buddhism.
Right, and a lot of Muslims considered Hinduism, we can't assert it because it's not mentioned in the Quran. The Quran does mention lesser lights, distant lights,
Oh.
and so the Muslims, many of the Muslims felt, like Al-Baruni did a whole study of Hinduism, and in fact, one of the great Esfarayini, in his book on heresiology, actually has a whole chapter on Buddha, which I wrote about. I have a article called Buddha in the Quran.
Oh.
And he makes an argument that he said, if what the Buddhists say is true, then he's Al-Khidr, which is the green man who's mentioned in the Quran, and Buddha is often portrayed in green jade. In any case, I have no problem believing that these were revelations and dispensations. I mean, the vast majority of Hindus believe in one God. You know, a lot of Muslims think they're idolaters, but a true understanding of Hinduism is actually they believe in this ultimate. I mean, they have the Trimurti, you know, the idea of Brahma and Vishnu and Shiva. So
but if the Muslim tradition says that each peoples have their own prophets, the assumption is those prophets are saying some things that are not accurate or not
well,
true?
they spoke for their time, so sometimes it's cultural. Their laws would differ, but the ultimate truth of one God, the prophets speaking through that one God, or you know, avatars, or however you want to call it, and then the idea of a judgment. That these would be considered fundamental
and
beliefs.
Is that good enough to make it? Like the Noahide laws from the Jewish point of view would give non-Jewish people, if they fulfill that, really kind of the same thing.
And it's an easy ticket, 7, not 613.
Right. So
on the train bound for glory.
So, but does in the Islamic tradition, how do you then view the other traditions who didn't become Muslim but maintained either the old dispensation?
The Quran says in the 5th chapter that we have given every people's a shari'ah, a sacred law, and a minhaj, and a way of methodology to follow that. And had we wanted, God would have made all of them one. So vie with one another in virtue. And so there's a kind of withholding. Like, we do believe that we have superseded the previous religions, but we recognize that there's a wisdom in that God has left these religions in the world. And we are not allowed to force them to become Muslim. They become Muslim with their own choice. And God will judge them on the day of judgment. I cannot say, if I say you're going to hell, I've done a sin. I cannot say that. I can say that to no individual. I can say that to no individual as a Muslim.
But yet, as a Muslim, you do believe that the only certain way you'd be 100% sure they'd be in paradise is being a Muslim.
A true Muslim.
A true Muslim.
Yeah. Not the true Scottish fallacy. I don't like that fallacy. You don't know that one?
Right.
The true Scotsman fallacy.
Well,
you know, it's like, the Scottish man's reading in the newspaper that somebody got raped. You know, he's a Scotsman would never do that. And the next day he finds out it was a Scotsman. He said, well, a true Scotsman would have never done that. That was one of those.
Good. So I think we could say with some confidence that the Abrahamic religions worship the same God. The Islamic view may be that it is more of an accurate description, having superseded the former Christian and Jewish. The Christian would say they have superseded the Jewish. The Jewish would say, you guys think you've superseded us, but we're the real truth. So, all right, we'll accept that. But I don't think any of them would fight with the idea that you're worshiping the same God, although the Trinity throws a little bit of a wrench into that wheel, at least from the Jewish point of view, and I think from the Muslim point of view. So question is, do the major religions worship the same God? And there are two questions I have for you to tackle. Number one is, because Christianity has a Trinity, is that the same God that is worshipped by the name of Allah, or the Tetragrammaton, the name of the Hebrew God?
Right.
Although, is Allah the same as the Hebrew God, and is Allah the same as the Trinity? Let's deal with that as one question. And the other question is, go further afield, Hinduism and then Buddhism, which really doesn't have a God, but has sort of a cosmic consciousness quasi-God.
Right.
And Hinduism has God, which is a God that is, this is my words, not theirs, derivative from a Brahman, from a cosmic consciousness, sort of. This cosmic consciousness devolves a God, or a God emerges from the cosmic consciousness, but is definitely secondary to this fundamental consciousness. So, handle it.
Well, I think Bismillah. I think that one of the things is there's all these different perspectives that people are looking from. There's that famous story of the elephant, the three blind men.
Right.
One of them's feeling,
Indian story.
an Indian story, feeling the trunk, feeling the stump, feeling the ears.
And everybody's right.
And everybody's right, but at the same time, they're all wrong.
Right.
So I think God is so beyond anything that we can comprehend. And so all of these languages are attempts to articulate something that ultimately is ineffable. The Tao which can be named is not the eternal Tao.
One of my favorite verses.
It's a beautiful verse, And so I think for Muslims, Allah, God, and Allah does really mean God. The Christians use Allah in Arabic. So they actually call Jesus the Son of Allah. And people forget that. And Aramaic also. I did not see it, but apparently in the Passion of Christ, when the figure is on the cross, he says Ilah, which is it's Hebrew, Aramaic, Elohim. This is so Ilah in Arabic is God. El Ilah, like we have Muslims named Abdul Ilah, the son of the God. So Elohim. So I think Jews and Christians worship the same God conceptually also. Christians worship the same God, but the conception is different. And from our perspective, and from the Jewish perspective, it's not a correct perception, because they have made these personas, the hypostases. They've given God three in one, and so for Muslims that's problematic. So we don't believe in God the Father, God the Son, and then the Holy Ghost. And then there's a lot of Christian differences about, does the Holy Spirit emanate from the Father and the Son, co-eternal. And,
we could spend the rest of eternity debating that.
So for Muslims, we believe that if we're talking about the Creator of the heavens and the earth, however we conceptualize that, we're talking about the same God. We just might have misconceptions about the attributes or how we describe that God, but it's the same God. And that's why I believe, I've heard many Christians say, Muslims, they worship a different God. Allah is not God.
Right.
And I think, first of all, they need to study more Christian history, because I have to say, I find it incredibly ironic that the Catholic doctrine since 1832 is from St. Thomas Aquinas. And St. Thomas Aquinas quotes Muslim theologians and philosophers constantly. After Augustine, some of the most quoted are Ibn Rushd, Averroes, and Ibn Sina, Avicenna. So Aquinas benefited greatly from Muslim theologians and scholastics, and some of his arguments are from them.
Yeah, no doubt.
So, and I think the educated Catholics, people like my friend Dr. Robbie George at Princeton, these Catholics that are educated, they know that the Muslim God is the same God, but they believe in the Trinity, and that's why Muslims can marry Christians and Jews. They cannot marry pagans, but they can marry Christians and Jews.
So pagan is defined as
anybody outside of the Abrahamic faith.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So Hindus and Zoroastrians were traditionally treated as people of the book, like so the dominant opinion of the Muslims is that all peoples are to be respected, even the pagans, and they can live. There is a minority opinion that only Abrahamic peoples can live under Muslims, but it's never been practiced.
And so, what about the Hindus and then the Buddhists who don't even have a God? They have something fundamental that may be something like God, but it's certainly it's impersonal.
They have something of ultimate concern, and they do have a sense of reality.
Yes.
And I think the Pew polls show that almost 70% of Buddhists in India believe in God, and I think a lot of Buddhists do believe in God.
I think so. I think so. I think that's so too.
I mean, I know American Buddhists that believe in God.
Yeah, but that's sort of an individual decision, and
sure,
kind
it's
of
not part of the doctrine.
A syncretic approach to.
I mean, Dr. Thomas Cleary was probably the foremost Buddhist scholar in the United States and greatest translator of Buddhist texts into English. I mean, he really saw Buddhism as a technique that all religions could benefit from.
Yeah, and a lot do. A lot of people think there's no incoherence in being a Buddhist and a Jew at the same time.
Right.
But if you look at the doctrines, that's not. That's just not it.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of different doctrines in Buddhism. I mean, if we read, Dr. Cleary saw the Prophet Muhammad prophesied in the Dhammapada.
I think everybody sees everything, and I get letters every week who people find the secrets of quantum mechanics in the Upanishads or in the numerology in the Bible.
I think there is some truth to the Upanishads, maybe.
Yeah. Well, but there's a lot more speculation and hope than I think than reality.
Well, I think,
and it's not it shouldn't be dependent upon. That should not be. If you're looking to try to prove the revelation of these scriptures by scientific prescience, I think you're in trouble.
Although I do think, like the Quran, to me, if people are willing to put in the time, there are very powerful arguments in the Quran that a lot of people aren't aware of. There are like syllogistic arguments that are there for people to ponder, and the Quran does call us to reflect.
So one way that atheists make fun of religious people is that if God is all powerful, God created the universe, and God created the world, and all God's all good, this should be the best of all possible worlds. Right. And philosophers, again, mainly in the Christian tradition, go through various complex arguments to show that that's not an effective atheistic argument, because creating the best possible world is a logical impossibility. Right. Because whatever you can imagine is the best possible world, I can add one more sentient being who goes to heaven or whatever, and that's a better one than that you have. You said that's the best, then I can add another one, and it goes on, and so it becomes logically impossible to have a best possible world. I think that was
Aquinas' view. Yeah.
Is that a legitimate question to ask? If God had a choice, some say that God didn't have a choice, but most Abrahamic deep thinkers believe that God had a choice. God did not have to create the world, that God created the world out of love and a desire to share his godness with other sentient creatures. I think that's a dominant theme in all the Abrahamic religions. Right. And if that's so, why didn't God create? You'd have to assume God created the best one, or God created an infinite number of ones, and we just happen to be one of them.
Right. Well, there's a very interesting Voltaire's Candide, making fun of Professor Pangloss going all over the world to find out, is this the best of all possible worlds? I mean, he was making fun of German philosophy. But he ends up in Turkey, and they find the Sufi, and then they go to the Sufi and ask him, is this the best of all possible worlds? And he gives them quite a harsh remark. And then they see the Turkish man eating the sherbet and just at total peace. And then Candide says, what's the secret of life? He said, tend your own garden. And so they end up doing that, and every once in a while they have their debates. But I think there's a lot of truth to that, tending our own gardens here in this world. In terms of being the best of all possible worlds, there's a famous statement of that is attributed to Imam al-Ghazali, ليس في الإمكان أبدع مما كان, which means something like, there's not in this contingent world a more wondrous world. And his books were burnt in Andalusia for saying that. So the Muslims of Spain actually burnt his books and rejected that statement. But I think
Why?
Because they thought that it was a kind of heretical statement to suggest that God could not make a more perfect world.
Because that seemed to limit the power of God?
Yeah, I think they misunderstood the statement, because I think what Imam al-Ghazali was saying was that for serving the purpose, this is the best of all possible worlds. Yeah. For serving God's purpose in creating the world, that this is the best of all possible worlds. It serves that purpose. But the paradise is infinitely better than this world that we're in now. But it's the best world we have for now, and so we have to take care of it. And I mean, one of the my father's teachers, Mark Van Doren, once said that he didn't like didactic literature. He loved literature that just presented the world as it was. Mm-hmm. And he said Shakespeare loved the world. He loved the world with all of the characters, with Iagos and you know, all the good characters and the bad characters. You know, he loved it all. And I think he said in the way that God must love his world that he's created, with everything in it, because it is perfect in that way. And there's a verse in the Quran that if you look to the world, you will not see any flaw in it. And then it says, return your glance and look again, and you will not see any fault. In other words, if you're seeing a fault, the fault is in you. And there's...
So that's an argument that this is the best possible world.
Yeah, exactly. And so there's a wonderful tradition where the Prophet Muhammad said that when you wake up in the morning, if you find good, then praise God. But if you find other than good, then blame only yourself, because you're not seeing the good. You know, God looked upon the world and saw that it was good. Yeah. And so it's all there to serve a purpose, especially for the believer, because we're accepting whatever God presents to us with a submission. So may God give you good health, but if I was afflicted with some disease, as a believer, I would hope, I don't know how I would react, but I would hope that I would react appropriately, which is to accept the tribulation that God's given me. And I mean, it doesn't mean I can't work to treat it if I could, but I should still accept it with a submission. And so I think from that point of view, everything in the world is good for the believer.
Are we forced in our theological commitments to say that this is the best possible world that God could have made for the purposes that God has, even if we can't understand it? Are we forced to that conclusion? Is there
I don't think so. Yeah, I don't think so.
So what's the alternative? What would be the alternative then?
I mean, I think we could conceive of many things in our minds. We could conceive of...
No, we can conceive, yeah. but I'm asking, if you compare a better world would be that instead of being 5'6", I was, 6 feet tall. That would give me better skill. Maybe I would have been a better basketball player.
You and I share that. Exactly, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a better world, but is it, but that's not, I wouldn't criticize God for having sub-optimized the world because I'm not 6 feet tall.
Right, exactly. I mean, I think that's the proper position to take, that we should be pleased with what God's given us and just be grateful for what we have. I think the Prophet, peace be upon him, he said, always look on people that are less fortunate than you and never people that are more fortunate than you, because it will give you gratitude in your heart.
So the question of what is God's relationship to abstract objects sounds like it's a very abstract question,
right? But
it really looks deeply into the aseity, the God's independence and God's total control of all reality, which is a fundamental a characteristic belief of certainly the Abrahamic religions. And the problem goes like this. If you believe that abstract objects like numbers, logic, propositions, universals, generalities, are somehow really existent, like you cannot imagine that 2 + 2 is not equal to 4. And even if there was no world, that would still be a true statement. And even if nothing ever existed, if the statement would be if something existed, and if there were 2 and 2 things, it would always be 4. I don't think anybody disputes that. The question is what is the grounding for such abstract objects? Because if they exist necessarily, meaning there's no way they could not have existed, it means that that was not created. So many philosophers believe that it's impossible for God to have created 2 + 2 = 4 because there's no alternative. What, God could make 2 + 2 = 5? That's impossible. So 2 + 2 = 4. And so if you have all these things, then God is surrounded for all eternity with a blizzard, a snowstorm blizzard with all these abstract objects floating around that God somehow has to deal with. Now that doesn't make sense either.
Yeah.
So you have 2 sets of circumstances that seem to be universally exhaustive, neither one of which makes sense.
Right.
So how do you deal with that question?
Well, I think, for us, the abstract ideas have what we call wujud dhihni, which is a mental existence. And then there's the extra-mental existence of the created world. The mental existence, the ability to abstract, is a fundamental quality of the human mind. Yeah. The ability to, and it's to take the universal out of the particular. So but I can nowhere in the world point to the universal man. I can't. But the universal man exists in my mind. If he didn't exist in my mind, I wouldn't know what a particular man was.
That's right. And
so abstraction is one of the great gifts of God. And it's essentially the ability to see the one in the many, which is one of the I mean, this is a fundamental metaphysical pursuit of understanding the relationship of the one and the many. So in Arabic, the word abstraction means to denude, to literally to strip of any clothing. So you get to the form, and you see the quiddity, the mahia of the thing. Quiddity, quid-est, actually comes from the Arabic. They translated it from the Arabic, mahia, what is it? And that understanding that the human mind is capable of, that ability to perceive with extraordinary clarity what a thing is a gift from God. Now are there these Platonic archetypal universals somewhere in a perfect world? Is there the perfect circle? Is there the perfect horse? All of these things are in the knowledge of God, and I have no doubt about that. I mean, God has knowledge of all things, and then He has given us some infinitesimal portion of knowledge to let us to understand knowledge, to give us a glimpse into that God is the knower. He's given us this infinitesimal ability to hear, to let us understand when God said He hears and sees all things. So these are all approximations, but in reality they're canceled out in the knowledge of God. So anything that we understand or know, I mean, numbers are fascinating because numbers are abstractions. A lot of people think that numbers have some kind of extra mental existence, but they don't. We're the ones putting these 2 chairs together. And a nominalist would say, there's no 2 chairs. There's this entity and there's this entity. It's your mind that's playing a trick on you by pulling those together. So that abstraction, though, of knowing what a chair is, I mean, there's a kind of fuzzy logic, obviously, but where you get into is it this or is it that anymore? Like, when's a table not a table? But if the abstract object is a conscious imposition of our ability to make sense of reality, and therefore that generalization doesn't exist. It's a nominalist or a fictionalist approach, and I mean, that's one explanation. Other people say that
you're denying the reality of something that you can't get rid of. You can't get rid of these numbers no matter what you do.
Right.
If there was no humans who could conceptualize this, before 10 billion years ago, the universe was still there. There were maybe there's no life.
Would they exist?
But the statement was just as true then, with no conscious beings around to conceptualize than it is today.
With God.
Yeah, except God, if God exists. So therefore, some people say that these abstractions are ideas in the mind of God, because you can't get rid of their existence. But you'd rather, and again, I don't want to differentiate you from the Islamic or Muslim tradition, but what are the Muslim traditions about dealing with these abstract objects? Are they creations of God? Are they fictions that they really don't exist? It's just our imposition on it?
So there's definitely the aspect of that they exist in the knowledge of God. I mean, they have to, like, God has knowledge of them. And in that way, they have what would be akin to our mental existence. I mean, if I have the concept of fire in my head, it's a mental existence of the fire. It's not an extra mental existence, or my head would burn.
Yeah, sure.
Right. So God has knowledge of all the abstractions, but He has given us the ability to abstract because He wants us to see the one in the many. He wants us to see the one behind the multiplicity of this world. I mean, one of the reasons why the Muslims were so obsessed with tessellations is because they go on for infinity. So it's this kind of replication. And so all our mosques are filled with these tessellations. A Russian scientist, mathematician, worked out there are only 17 possible infinite tessellations. 14 are in the Alhambra Palace.
Wow.
So that's the one and the many presenting itself geometrically to people, to see that. And so, but again, it's seeing the one, universus, seeing the one out of the diversity is the ability of, that's why we're muwahidun, we are makers of one. The only way we can communicate is through abstraction. The only way we can say these words is because we've abstracted their meanings. And all of the particularizations of the world are understood through abstraction. We couldn't talk about, I need a cup of coffee right now, if somebody didn't have the universal concept of a cup of coffee. So it's quite stunning. I mean, abstraction is fascinating, it's important, and it's what gives us our minds.
Hamza, the Islamic tradition is very rich in its geometric architecture, in its mosques, especially the great mosques are just marvels of architecture. What is it about that architecture that creates a sacred space?
I think that sacred space is a very interesting concept. Sacred space, and there's also sacred time. So for instance, every religion has times that are more important for the religion than other times. In our tradition, the Prophet ﷺ said that the whole world has been made a place of devotion for me. The whole earth. He said masjid, he called it a masjid, a place, a mosque. So the whole earth is a mosque. And this is why Muslims, like Christians, worship in the church. I mean, they can pray in other places, but their worship is in the church, the Jews in the synagogue. So the Muslims can pray anywhere on the earth because the whole earth is a mosque. So in that way, the whole earth is sacred space for Muslims. And then there's sacred time, like Ramadan is a sacred time. So what makes it sacred? I mean, the first thing and the most important thing is that in our belief, God has designated these places and these times to get closer to Him. There are certain times, like the Prophet Muhammad said, that the last third of the night before dawn is the night when somebody is closest to God. And I once saw an amazing a man who does Zen bows, the archery bow. He was a Japanese man. And he said the only time he could make it was the hour before dawn, because he said it was the time when his ego was absent. and he said that the degree with which his ego was in the bow, there was a defect in the bow. And I just thought that was so interesting, because that would resonate with a Muslim, because that time is, anybody that spends time before dawn, like that hour before dawn, will know the special time. And most people are deprived of that time. Just a very beautiful time. Dawn is a beautiful time. Seeing the dawn emerge is a wonderful thing also. So these are really important. In terms of mosques can be very simple. They're not meant to be have any graven images. It's very important. That's why geometry became a kind of sacred art of the Muslims, and calligraphy. So you will find in mosques both calligraphy, which is celebrating the word, because it's abstraction. Neil Postman wrote a wonderful book about the danger of images and amusing ourselves to death. And in the second chapter, he talks about the Decalogue and the importance of not making graven images, because he said, if God wanted a community to abstract, and to abstract the greatest abstraction, which is an understanding of reality, then he would not want them to be distracted by images. And so, Plato also understood that, this idea of having these, that we're already divorced once from reality. So if we add images to it, now we're twice divorced. And they're very distracting. And one of my favorite definitions of evil is from Franz Kafka, who said evil is whatever distracts. And one of the things about pre-modern peoples, the word in English, distracted, means insane. Bethlehem was the hospital for the incurably distracted. And so the modern world is a distraction. So sacred space is meant to remove distractions. And that's why it's very important for that space to be a kind of empty space. One of the things that when the Roman emperor, I think it was Hadrian, one of the Roman emperors, when he went into the holiest of holies in the Jewish temple, he couldn't believe there were no idols in it. It was an empty space, and he couldn't understand it. He was like, what's going on here? What are you worshiping? No thing. And even when we talk about God, even though it's permitted to use thing for God to avoid no thing, the word in Arabic for thing means that which, literally means that which was willed into existence. So a thing is already a created phenomenon. So God is beyond thingness in that way.
How about the art itself in mosques, specifically the great mosques, with incredible tessellation are these geometric patterns that cover it and just give you a feeling of great space and great movement into beyond that which you can see.
Well, geometry was generally an obsession with the Muslim civilization early. Euclid was translated 34 times into Arabic, more than any other language, 28 times in Latin, but 34 times in Arabic. It was a fundamental text that was taught in all the colleges and madrasas of the Muslim world for centuries. And the reason for that is, well, one of the fundamental reasons is it gives you these demonstrative proofs. So it has a type of rationality that shows you in abstraction that there are things that are real and can be proved to be true, QED, that it's been demonstrated. And so they love to put this sacred geometry in their mosques to remind people of this other dimension of reality. And one of the things that we're seeing now with fractals, and as we go deeper, we're seeing all these geometrical patterns. I mean, snowflakes themselves, it's just stunning. The pilgrimage itself, when we go on Hajj, there's a circle around a square, a cube. You make a circle around a cube, then you go on a straight line back and forth, and then it ends with the point on the day of Arafat. So all of the geometrical forms are there. The polygon, the circle represents that which has no beginning and that which has no end. So it's often been a symbol for God, for God.
So you see all of these different images. How did the tessellation begin as a process? Was that an innovation, and then? Well,
I think that there was some tessellation from previous civilizations, no doubt. But the Muslims developed it in a way I mean, but people that study tessellation study Islamic art.
Of course.
Yes.
Is there a theological meaning to it?
Well, it's this idea of the infinite, you know, the one becoming infinite in diverse, in many. So it has the one and the many contained in the display, and it's quite vertigious when you see it. Really, it has an effect on the soul. Sacred spaces, I think, all share a certain commonality. Even when you go into a great cathedral or a pagoda or a Hindu temple, there's always a sense of that this space is different from other spaces. And I think it's the intentions of the builders and also the intentions of those who go into them to worship. So devotion is a beautiful thing.